What's up, guys? This is Coach Boyer, and I'm going to be covering spot blocking. Spot blocking is an ideology that helps simplify your teaching and approach to run game within the offensive line room. This is something that I've done a lot of research on within the past couple of months, and I think it's something that is incredibly beneficial when it comes to making everything as simple as possible for your offensive line and allowing them to play as fast as possible. So here's an overview of the presentation on the general idea of spot blocking. So I'm going to be talking about what spot blocking is, why to choose spot blocking, where to start in spot blocking, teaching on a micro level, teaching on a macro level, covered versus uncovered, spot blocking examples, and at the end, I'll give you guys my Twitter handle. So if you want to follow me, if you have more questions or you want a clinic, I'll be more than happy to do so. So what is spot blocking? Spot blocking is an area assignment base instead of a man assignment. So no matter what run scheme you install, you'll be able to talk about areas and who's going to be covering what area in the run scheme rather than like, hey, you're going to block this guy. And what this is a more fluid approach to run game against almost any defense that you're possibly going to see in a given season. And knowing that there are some defenses who give 100 different looks, it's going to keep you from drawing 100 different cards to get every kind of look. Your offensive line is going to be able to attack without really having to hesitate during a game, during practice, whatever. So why choose spot blocking? Like I said before, it simplifies assignments based on defensive alignment, cuts down on teaching, installing, and drawing. So when you're going through your installs on the weekly basis, you're not having to show how you're going to block it against several different fronts. Um, once you teach it, once you start beating it into their heads, it's going to be pretty simple to keep moving forward within a season based on who's blocking what. Nothing's really going to change unless you absolutely have to in a given season. With that, it allows a more fluid and responsive post-snap defensive movement. You're not going to have offensive linemen freak out because defenses move post-snap, which, depending on the defense you're going to see, you're either going to see a ton of movement post-snap or not very much. Either way, it shouldn't really matter. With that, it also allows your offensive line to play fast. It cuts out thinking. Again, with it being simple, they're not going to have to think as much about what they're doing. They just have to trust their rules and keep moving. And then also with that, it reduces needed communication. So if you want to cut out the communication aspect, as long as everybody's on the same page, you shouldn't have a ton of pre-snap communication unless they see blitz, which allows you to get the ball snapped as fast as possible. And lastly, terminology does not change between positions. It allows players to move into different positions based on different situations. So if there's injuries, you could slide guys into different spots and nothing's really going to change other than a couple minor tweaks. And then if you want to have a rotation within your offensive line, but you want to keep 3 to 4 guys out there, you just want to shuffle them around, you should be able to do that seamlessly. So where to start? So for teaching this and understanding it, as a coach, you have to understand the basic of a defensive box. The defensive box needs to account for the 6 gaps surrounding the offensive line. So from C to C gap, the defensive line has to have that accounted for. And if you bring more players into the box, so a tight end, a sniffer, whatever you want to call it, they're going to have to account for more gaps. And no matter what, they have to account for them if they want to be sound in the run game. So once you understand that and you get your offensive line to understand that, moving forward within the spot blocking and the terminology around it is going to be a lot easier to install. Also, once you understand that aspect, you want to move towards what run game do you want to have to hang your hat on. My personal belief is 4 to 6 run plays that you need to perfect. Anything more than that is overkill, and your guys are never going to get a strong grip on what you're blocking. Anything less, you're just not going to be incredibly versatile in what you're able to do in terms of moving the ball on the ground. And then lastly, find different ways to exploit extra gaps. Your offensive line's not going to be able to block all 6 gaps. If you find a way, please let me know. But you have to find different ways and be creative on how you're going to exploit extra gaps. And you can do that through QB reads, tight end swipes, cracks from a wide receiver. There's a bunch of different ways where you can exploit that last gap. But know that you're going to have to do that in order to be successful on the ground. So teaching on a micro level. So this is just teaching one offensive lineman the scheme by itself and then piecing it together after that. So the way I teach it, and again, you don't have to live by this, but there are 2 gaps that an offensive lineman is going to be responsible for depending on the play. The first gap is the zone gap. So that's the gap to the call side run. So if they're responsible for their zone gap, it's more than likely going to be based on outside zone or inside zone. So they're going to be going to the call side of the run. The down gap is the gap away from the call side run. And when they're going to be responsible for their down gap is in run scheme like power, counter, and pin and pull on the play side. Implementing the zone gap versus down gap into your verbiage is going to reduce a ton of teaching time and correction time. So for example, if you're installing this and you're installing outside zone, and you break it down as simple as you have 2 gaps on either side of you, you're like, what gap are you responsible for on outside zone if we're running it to the left? Everybody as quickly as possible should be, I'm responsible for my zone gap, which is in outside zone to the left, it'll be the gap to my left. If it's power to the right, awesome. What gap are you responsible for? Coach, I'm responsible for my down gap, which is the gap to my left. And it's as simple as that. Keeping it this simple is going to cut down on the words that you're going to need in order to teach everything. And the more words you can cut out of your teaching, the more effective you're going to be as a teacher. And it's going to be easier for your players to remember everything that they need to do because there are less words involved in the teaching. So teaching on a macro level, when you have the entire offensive line together and you're installing this, the number one point of emphasis has to be that 5 of the 6 gaps must be accounted for between the offensive line. No more, no less. There's always going to be a guy who wants to account for multiple gaps in an offensive line room. And for him, it's important for him to understand that he has one gap and he has to win that one gap. Once you've built that understanding, you have to move on to the idea that these gaps go beyond the line of scrimmage. They go to the second level, they go to the third level. So once they get this understanding of these gaps don't just disappear once they leave the line of scrimmage, it's going to help them with their eye discipline and trusting that something's going to come to them if the defense is playing gap sound football. Another important aspect of spot blocking is determining whether an offensive lineman is covered or uncovered. So if there's a defender on any part of an offensive line's body, so anywhere on their cylinder, they should be considered covered. However, it's important to understand that gap responsibility takes precedence in this situation. So here are some examples down here at the bottom. If we are running the ball in this situation right here, so these are separate. If we're running the ball to the left here, so it's inside zone left, both of these guys are covered, all right? So if there's nobody over here, this offensive lineman is going to be working with his backside buddy to move this guy out of his gap. But when they're moving this guy out of this gap during this combo, this guy has to have his eyes to his left in case any threat comes through. All right? But here's where it changes. All right? So, if for whatever reason, got my wrong utensil here. If for whatever reason there's another defender right here, his gap is now covered. So that means that he can no longer worry about this guy. he has to worry about working through his gap and taking the immediate threat that's in his gap. All right. So if we're running, let's say outside zone to the right here, he is covered. He must take this guy and get him out of this gap by any means necessary. He has to track with, ensure that his gap has no immediate threat before he can climb. All right. And there's going to be more videos that I post later on that get into the nuances of different blocking schemes, but this is a general outlook of covered versus uncovered. So, to make a long story short, if an offensive lineman is covered anywhere on his cylinder, he is considered covered with the understanding that his gap responsibility takes precedence. Remember that gap over everything else. So if there's no threat, you're going to work to the nearest defensive lineman that is to your play side or down gap side, depending on the run call. And you're going to work through that gap. If there's no threat, you're going to climb. So here's some examples of spot blocking between zone gaps and then our gaps and our gap schemes. So this is more of a depiction of where the offensive line needs to have their eyes on any given situation. So if this is zone right, let's say zone read, we're reading this backside gap. Every offensive lineman needs to have eyes immediately to their gap once the ball is snapped. Obviously, their steps are going to change depending on where they're covered and who they're working to. Um, but in this situation, with it being a zone scheme, they need to have their eyes to their zone gap. So this is zone right. Everybody needs to get their eyes to the right as soon as possible. All right. For our T counter scheme, this is where offensive line's eyes need to go. With it being a gap scheme, their eyes should be going away from the call side. All right, so this is T counter right. Our tackle is going to be pulling for what we call the point on the second level. Our guard is going to be kicking out the play side C gap, and then everybody else is down through their down gap. The center is going to have a double gap. So depending on where the threat is, he's going to take the most immediate threat between these two gaps. All right, guys. So that's it on the general idea of spot blocking. Feel free to follow me on Twitter. We can set up a Zoom call, set up more, or discuss more offensive line play. Just follow me at OL Coach Boyer on Twitter. I'll be sure to try to follow you back as soon as possible. Like I said, I have no problem getting on a phone call, a Zoom call. We can talk more about this. If you have any questions, feel free to hit me up. Thank you guys for watching.